Thank you. Hope they're not blinding.
If you want, just take it. Like the vest too.
Well, I wanted to make my best impression.
You were well invested. Joe, how are you? So good to see you. Glad you're here. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh boy. Yeah, these are interesting. Oh yeah, I brushed up on your questions and Ed's questions and my own in the back room just here.
We're going to have to kind of ad-lib this. I don't have my sheet, that book, so I will introduce you and we will wing it. Sure. Okay. We're going to continue the evening now and have our guests introduced to you. From my immediate right is Mr. Ed Berlin, sitting here as the author of the biography of Scott Joplin. He is a published author of 3 different books and been a teacher and educator and is known all over the world for his knowledge of ragtime and music of all kinds, but specifically he is the authority on Scott Joplin vis-a-vis his book that was heralded by critics internationally as the book for Scott Joplin. Mr. Ed Berlin to the right.
Thank you.
Next to him is Charlie Judkins, who is a piano player with the Jazz Artistes, is one of our acts tonight, coming on actually right after we're here. Charlie Judkins, pianist.
Thank you.
And to his right is Jeff Barnhart, who is also a pianist extraordinaire. So there is a plethora of questions about, I think there's more disagreement about certain things surrounding ragtime than there is sometimes agreement. There's all kinds of points of view. I think what I would like to do is have Mr. Berlin begin the conversation, and we'll move from there on his position about is ragtime the bridge to jazz and swing, or is it not? And if so, talk about it for a moment with us.
Well, of course, ragtime came before swing and before jazz. Ragtime's dates are roughly from the early 1890s until World War I. And as we've heard, the original Dixieland Jazz Band appeared in New York in 1917 on the day that Joplin died. Well, actually, that's when they recorded. They appeared about 2 months earlier. So ragtime ran into jazz, and many of the same, both styles had many of the same performers, although there were new performers as well. And toward the end of the ragtime years, the music was changing rather drastically, as either of these 2 gentlemen could show. At first, with ragtime, there were stereotyped rhythms. At least that's in the music that we see. We don't know what it sounded like because we don't have too many recordings. So many of the players were improvising. Now, it is often written that the difference between ragtime and jazz is that ragtime is written down and jazz is improvised. Well, yes and no. I mean, as Jeff was saying, so many of the players, especially in the earlier years, couldn't read music. So obviously, they were not playing it as written. They were improvising. In particular, I came across a pianist by the name of, see, I have a piece of paper with me, I hope, because I forget names. Charlie Lee. And I'm sure these gentlemen never heard of Charlie Lee. The only thing I know about him is what I've seen in the few African-American newspapers from Leavenworth, Kansas. And I suppose he played in saloons, although in the newspapers, it seems he was playing at literary societies. He was playing at meetings of the newspaper guild, of the Black Newspaper Guild. And everyone raved about him. And there were some articles criticizing him, saying he does nothing but play rags and he can't even read music, and all he does is play rags in variations. Well, that's improvising. Yeah. So, I mean, certainly the best performers were always improvising. It's the people like me, if I had been around at that time, who would be playing the music as written, because I couldn't improvise very well.
Well, to follow up on that, yes, I do believe that ragtime was very much a style of improvisation as well as a style of composition. My impression after many years of researching this stuff, which is, these two gentlemen also know, researching ragtime and jazz is kind of a black hole. Just when you think you've figured everything out, new things and new angles just continue to turn up. But it seems to me that ragtime as a style of variation, as some people would call it, that it could be applied to pretty much any style of music, comedically or seriously. It does seem that that did anticipate ragtime as a style of composition. The first published use of the term ragtime, I believe, was a couple of songs published by the Whitmark Company in New York City that were published in 1896 with special ragtime variations with that term printed for one of the earliest, or in mainstream context for probably the first time, which were done by a Chicago pianist named Max Kaufman. And within these published tunes from, again, 1896, I think they outdate the first published ragtime composition, which most people say is William Krell's Mississippi Rag. I think that's from 1897, I believe, a year after that. And we don't start to get into the first published rags by African Americans until, well, I think 1897 was Tom Turpin's Harlem Rag, and then Joplin's
Yes. Just to say something about that, it was claimed that Tom Turpin wrote that rag in 1892. It wasn't published until 1897.
Right. I've heard that's another thing that I've heard time and time again, that ragtime was kind of an underground style of music, mostly only known in the African American community. But even though it did not become mainstream until it began turning up in sheet music coming out of New York City around 1896, and also showing up in New York vaudeville around that time, thanks to performers like Ben Harney, it did exist probably under other names and that name in the African-American community. Some would argue, there's a famous quote from Joplin saying that as long as the African-American people have been in this country, there has been ragtime music here.
In 1893 was the Chicago World's Fair, and that was the time when widespread America became aware of ragtime. Although it was not called ragtime then, it was simply called rag. And I think it was in 1896 that the term ragtime appeared.
Yeah, some people trace it back to a thing called a rag ball that was given, I think, in the city of Baltimore back in 1829. That's one new theory that's going around nowadays. But yes, and it's interesting that another parallel with jazz and ragtime is that the city of Chicago was extremely important in popularizing both styles of music, with the case of ragtime with the World's Fair in 1893, and then with jazz, it just seemed to be a hotbed for the early, the first groups that wanted to go out of New Orleans around 1915 and 16. It seems like they went straight to Chicago, and well into the 1920s with King Oliver and Louis Armstrong, the players from New Orleans that got good wanted to go right to Chicago. And again, jumping back to ragtime, that arranger I mentioned, Max Kaufman, he was based in Chicago. He probably heard ragtime at that fair in 1893. And the first published instrumental rags also were by two composer publishers from Chicago, Theodore Northrup and William H. Krell.
And in addition, talking about Chicago and the beginnings of jazz, we talked about the original Dixieland Jazz Band. By 1916, they were playing at Schiller's Cafe, and they were playing there in a way, I don't know who coined this term. Dan Levinson uses it a lot, raga jazz. I don't think he coined it.
I haven't heard that term.
It's this moment when ragtime was being played by bands, and the jazz feel and polyphony was starting to come into it. But coming back to New Orleans specifically, when they were playing their variations, they referred to it as ragging the tune.
Yeah.
They weren't using the term jazz. It was so ragtime as a style, as the syncopated sounds, whether it was printed or was being picked up by ear, was prevalent, especially in the Midwest and then down south to New Orleans. So ragging the tune was the terminology when you couldn't get it exactly right and you didn't care. You were playing variations, you were making it up as you went with nods to the original. So there was a connection.
Well, people were playing jazz and calling it ragtime. That's right.
Right, there's an autograph you can see from one of the first African-American groups to leave New Orleans and tour was a group called the Original Creole Orchestra. The lead cornetist was a great player named Freddie Capard, and you can see surviving autographs from him from around 1914 or 15 or so, and he signed his, despite what they were doing was most certainly probably, they didn't record, but I'm sure it was what would be called jazz by our ears, because so many people in that group did record later on and were certainly playing jazz. But Freddie Capard, when he was touring with this group in 1914, he still signed his autograph, Fred Capard, cornetist, Original Creole Ragtime Band. So a lot of this stuff, to me, it's interesting. They talk about what is the difference between ragtime and jazz. A lot of it is just terminology. There were a lot of guys, when jazz came in, they continued to play the ragtime they'd been playing for years. They just started to call it jazz. Tom Turpin, the first published black ragtime composer, he owned a series of clubs going back to the 1890s in the Rosebud Cafe. His last club was called Jazzland in 1917. And another interesting example, even John Stark, the famous publisher of Joplin's music, recently I saw a folio of the Joplin rags, probably republished from exactly as they originally appeared in the early 1900s, but this was a later publication from after Joplin's death in the 20s, and you know what he called them? Jazz Classics by Scott Joplin.
I did not know about that, because what Charlie is referring to originally came out around late 1911, 1912. It was compiled by one of Stark's relatives, E.J. Stark, and a guy called D.S. Delisle, who was the guy who had actually arranged for Turpin, at least he gets credit, the Harlem Rag from 1897. And it was a book that the New Orleans guys started calling the Redback Book, so-called because the binding was red, the front and back cover were red. In it were 15 arranged ragtime pieces from the sheet music that had been published by John Stark, including quite a few Joplin, I can't remember the exact number, some Scott, and a few random pieces as well. So in New Orleans, you had two kinds, just as you had in ragtime piano. You had two kinds of musicians, those who could read, and so they could learn the stuff that way, and those who would learn it by ear. There were a whole bunch of musicians in New Orleans who were in bands that were reading bands. They were getting the society gigs. They weren't just playing hot stuff, ragtime with that syncopation. They were playing waltzes, polkas, mazurkas, whatever was necessary. However, when they got hold of that Redback Book, now the magic is coming along because you're hearing all the different lines the fingers are playing when the piano scores in front of you, but you're hearing a different instrument play a certain line. So a trombonist who only plays by ear would start hearing what the trombone was doing in that arrangement. Say, hey, you know what? I'll throw some of that into my next gig. So I think ragtime directly informed what we would eventually call New Orleans-style ensemble-based polyphonic, meaning more than one melody occurring at a time, jazz. I think a lot of that influence and inspiration came directly from that publication.
Actually, going by what was written at the time, we have a distorted view of what ragtime was. Most people at that time, when they referred to ragtime, they were talking about vocal music, songs. Well, even today, songs, vocal music, are more popular than instrumental music. And that was true then as well, except possibly for the Maple Leaf Rag. That was the most popular piece around.
Sure.
Yeah.
And there was also a tradition of if a piece was a hit as an instrumental, they would as soon as possible rush out some lyrics to it and rush out a song version of it as quick. It was mostly an East Coast thing, but it was done elsewhere as well. I know it was done with some of Joplin's pieces, like Maple Leaf, for instance. Even often these pieces don't seem like pieces that should have words put to them. They're very pianistic, and to try, if you were to sit down and try to do one with a singer today, obviously you would quickly realize why they never caught on as songs, but they're trying to do that anyway. Sometimes it would go the other way around. You would have pieces like Dance of the Grizzly Bear by George Botsford that started as piano rags but didn't really become hits until they had words added to them. So, but yes, the ragtime was certainly thought of as a form of song, as a form of singing, just as much, if not more, as these piano instrumentals. And I know one more quick thing I wanted to add that's interesting is I think it was also greatly thought of by many people as a dance or just dance music. There was a trial transcript I was reading done in New York City during the period where Anthony Comstock was trying to really hold the city to Victorian values and clean it up. And I can't remember exactly what the purpose of this disposition was, but at one point there was a guy, a real honest-to-goodness New York street cop, and he was talking about some of the corruption and vileness he had seen in New York City, and this was around 1899, and out of the blue, the judge asked him if he'd heard of ragtime. What is ragtime? And this cop says, oh, sure, I know ragtime. That's that dirty dance that the kids are doing in the clubs. And that's all he knew it as. He didn't know it as a style of music. He knew it purely as a dance.
And of course, you see a lot of the published rags always say two-step, including Harlem Rag, and quite a few of Joplin's it says a two-step, because it was meant to be danced to, especially in its incarnation. But, you know, talking about the lyrics, that Red Rose Rag was a very popular instrumental rag in 1910, and then republished the next year, same exact notes, but now with words by a real sadist. His name was Edward Madden. And you're right, these songs should not be sung. They're very difficult, you know, tongue-tied, tongue twisters. But that one sold really well as well. So the instrumental and the vocal were being sold. W.C. Handy, the father of the blues, calls his St. Louis blues the greatest ragtime hit ever written, right on the sheet music cover. And I'm paraphrasing, but the word ragtime is right there.
The Memphis Blues, when it was published, it says a southern rag. Yeah. Actually, you know, Memphis Blues was published 1912, but there was a piece published in 1911 that is a perfect 12-bar blues in its verse. Now, most songs have a verse and a chorus. Everyone sings the chorus. They forget the verse. This song was very well known, Oh, You Beautiful Doll. But if you look at the verse, it's a perfect 12-tone blues.
Oh yeah, there were a few of those. That was one of the earliest. Also, Bill Bailey has a 12-bar verse to it, and a sister song of Bill Bailey written by friends of the authors called "Ain't That a Shame" from the year 1902, as well. And but it's an interesting thing. So it's the 12-bar form. It's not exactly a blues, but it does have that blues feeling to it, you know.
Oh, it does. It has blue notes in it.
Right. Yes, it's a very interesting thing.
Blue notes the same as bent notes, or are those not blue notes?
Well, I guess they are the same, yes.
Well, I mean, especially for pianists, right? If you're not a singer and you're an instrumentalist, horns can more easily bend a note. all right, to...
It's tough on the piano. Huh?
It's tough on a piano. You can slide, and that's one of the things
You're
we'll do.
really
We'll
good
slide from
piano
a black note to a white note.
Right, right.
Right, and could you give us an example real quick?
Sure.
Just because it's illustrative to hear that we can't slide like a trombone can or a clarinet can bend their note. We can't make that vocal human sound.
Well, here's a big one, of course. That's all just with the back of the hand. Then you could get into things. Things like that as well. And of course, you can do a good old, little trill.
Play a blue note.
All right. Well, my idea of a blue note is in terms of a lot of musicians tend to think of the major scale in terms of numbers rather than do, re, mi, fa, so. They would think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So often blue notes are the flatted third, which would be you go 1, 2, 3, and then you go to the note between 2 and 3. That's a blue note, a flat 3. Another popular one would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Flatted 6, and then to use that in context a little bit, that's no flatted third, and then using the flatted third.
That's it. Yeah, Charlie. That's exactly it. When you did that, that's what made it. And that's what they were all doing. So that's as close as you can get to a shout. You're sliding off the black note to the white note.
But you're actually hitting 2 notes at once.
Huh?
You're bending, you're bending, but you're hitting your 2 tones colliding there, correct?
The 2 tones are colliding. You slide off one. Yeah, I mean that's all we can do as pianists to try all those tricks Charlie just showed you to try and emulate the human voice. The other horns have it a lot easier for that. And then later on, of course, people like King Oliver would start using a lot of mutes. That changed the sound of the trumpet, the cornet, and gave you that human sound. So,
Speaking of piano players, can the 2 of you give me an idea, because I would like to understand the difference between stride and boogie woogie, because both of them I like very much, and I'm not convinced they're that different, but maybe they are. Help me out.
Well, I would say boogie tends to have more what you would call walking bass figures, and there's a lot of ways to do that. But it's
The left hand is different in boogie than stride.
yeah, it's closer to what a modern day bass player would be doing. I would say it's not really, in ragtime or stride, you generally will have a bass note followed by a chord, followed by another bass note, followed by a chord. And you can break, once you get used to that repetitive pattern, you can break it up in a couple certain different ways, or I'll demonstrate again real quick.
Boogie Woogie is really more like a blues, but without the lamentation of the blues. And it has this mechanical bass that will be illustrated.
I think we're doing typical ragtime left hand. You'd have note, chord, note, and chord. And once you start doing that, you can get into some variations. You can do a little walk here and there. When you get into boogie playing, which I'm not by no means a master of, but it tends to be more of this kind of a thing. Some kind of walking figures. They could be more tightly spaced out. It could be more something like things like that. There's lots of ways to doing it. In the 40s, they got into doing figures kind of like basically just something that the left hand is doing that's more melodic and has more of a melody to it than just, which is almost closer to the sound of a tuba or a jug or something.
yeah, and definitely march related, right?
Yes, oh yeah, definitely.
And in a way, as Ed just said, the boogie woogie is essentially it's blues on speed. I'm not a boogie player either, but essentially what's happening is that the lamentation, the sadness has been taken out. Another thing that those guys were doing, and I wouldn't try and play anything in the right hand because I don't play boogie, but they were almost as if they were strumming a horizontal guitar, which you can hear a guitarist play very easily, right? So well, just real quickly, I'll do 2 bars of boogie-ish, and then 2 bars of
He says
stride.
he doesn't play boogie.
Before you leave the piano,
Before you leave the piano, go back.
Up.
Illustrate stride now.
All right, so now the thing about, I don't know if this is on, Travis. Hello, Travis, is this on? No, it's not, that's okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, so here's the thing, is that Ragtime, especially as Joplin was writing it, stayed rather close to the center of the keys, all right? Still had that pa bass chord that Charlie illustrated. And then on occasion, one particular beautiful thing about Joplin-esque ragtime are the beautiful melodies. It's a very lovely melody. However, because the melody is so pretty, Joplin, the composer, wanted you to really focus on it, so the left hand becomes almost childlike. So you can hear. Well, the stride guys come along and they say, that's just not interesting enough. I want to play lower notes. I want to play more notes in my chords. So the left hand becomes more expansive, covering more of the piano keys. As well, your stride guys were much less interested in melody. Nope, that's not the one. Oh, maybe it's off. Is it off, Travis? Do I have it off over here?
It's not on.
It's not on. That's all right. So the thing about it is that you no longer have beautiful melodies. I mean, sometimes you do, but they're more interested in rhythmic riffs. The syncopation is also not only in the right hand. Now it's also in the left hand. Instead of pa, you might get pa, exemplified by James P. Johnson. You wouldn't hear that rhythmic in earlier ragtime. So the stride is doing riffs in the right hand with a lot of rhythm. Left hand is much more complicated than the ragtime left hand had been. And that's pretty much it. It's also, again, at a much faster tempo usually. So it's too simplistic to say the stride is an advanced form of ragtime. It had its own ideas and its own purpose in a way. Certainly very far removed from Joplin's purpose in creating music.
thanks, guys. I'd like to ask a question to close the speaking panel portion of the evening. We have the jazz artistes coming up, so don't go anywhere after we're done with the speaking panel. We have a fantastic act coming on the stage. I'm curious about the discussion, the frequency of which I hear that brothels were the home of ragtime around the 1880s to the 1910 period, and that the juke joints and seedy kinds of red light districts were havens for the existence of fun and music, obviously, and frivolity and escapades. But is there truth to what you read in the literature about ragtime being the favorite in the brothels? Because my mother, who used to play the piano in our living room, would always tell me, I'm going to play some whorehouse piano.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's too many stories about that for it not to be true. Almost all these establishments had some kind of a, well, not all of them. That's the one thing I should say. It was certainly a place to hear ragtime, but it wasn't the only place to play it to hear ragtime. There were more, clean, family-friendly places to see it. Like I was saying, ragtime was huge in vaudeville, almost too huge to the point where vaudeville managers complained about getting too much ragtime in their acts in the early 1900s. There actually is documentation of that. And, places like, ice cream parlors and college campuses and nice places like that too. But certainly, they say that Tom Turpin's Rosebud Bar had a brothel upstairs in addition to gambling quarters and a wine room and several bar rooms and things like that, and many other famous establishments, especially across the Midwest and even in New York City as well. So I would say, yes, that's for the most part true, although it was not the only place to hear this kind of music.
But some people did go to brothels to hear the music.
Were you one of those people, Ed? Or do you prefer column B?
One of the early writers about ragtime insisted that he went to the brothels to hear the music. And he wrote about Jelly Roll Morton and
That's
and
where
other
the word
ragtime.
jive came from.
And I mean, we have to remember that, especially in certain areas of the world, in the country, perhaps the brothel was a central point of excitement and fun. And so you would not have a string quartet playing in the main salon. You would have the most recent music, which of course was, at that time, ragtime.
Musicians go where the work is.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, guys. Appreciate it. Very good. We'll take a quick change here. We'll be right back with Les Jazz Artistes.